A Tale of Six Daughters. Alaya, Daniela, and Reba were daughters who grew up in a world where women's interests and concerns really meant nothing. So to call Alaya, Daniela, and Reba second class citizens didn't capture what day to day life was like for young women in their world. Alaya, Daniela, and Reba, their world said to them, "You aren't you." Rather, it said, "You are identified by the man in your life, your father, your eldest brother, your husband." Now, if Alaya, Daniela, and Reba had been sons, especially firstborn sons, they would have been a big deal. They would have been the ones born to rule empires, communities, families. They would have held positions of honor and favor and received preferential treatment. Eventually, they would have become head of the entire household, at least, with complete authority over their dad's property, responsible for the family wealth, shaping the family name, the family identity within the community. They would receive a double portion if they were the firstborn, a double portion of their father's inheritance and their father's blessing. But alas, Alaya, Daniela, and Reba were daughters. They grew up in a world where women didn't have any personhood because women were property, objects. They were mentioned in the same breath as possessions, homes, oxen, donkeys, slaves. Women were only seen as extensions of men, and most women came to see themselves that way, through the eyes of men. It was a male dominated world of patriarchy where women had no rights of their own. So, for instance, if their own father encountered some kind of financial ruin or simply wanted to buy a new donkey, he could sell his daughters as slaves. And in their world, the line between a slave and a sex slave was blurry at best. Now, the world we live in is fraught with human trafficking that goes on under the radar. In Alaya, Daniela, and Reba's world, it happened right out in the open. The sale of a daughter as a slave was no surprise. If they were violated, they virtually had no recourse. When it came to questions of sexuality, most people in power, men, didn't consider the possibility of an innocent woman. Women weren't allowed to testify in court, and men were only considered guilty of immoral behavior if they had sex with another man's wife. So that left a lot of vulnerable women, including Alaya, Daniela, and Reba. Talk about being marginalized and oppressed. Talk about a precarious existence. Now, in our world, young women dream all kinds of dreams about their future. Not so in Alaya, Daniela, and Reba's world. The best alternative for girls like Alaya, Daniela, and Reba was to marry well. In many cases, either their father or their eldest brother would choose who they married. And the choice, of course, was not based on compatibility or good looks. It was all about the family name, economic advantage, marrying up, status. Their marriage to a rich man could open up doors for business opportunities for their father and their brothers, honor, status in the community. Now, being married to a rich man might sound good, but wives couldn't own property in that day. So it really didn't mean that all of their husband's wealth was somehow going to transfer directly to them if they were married off to a rich man. When a woman's husband died and she became a widow, she did not inherit her husband's wealth. She received her dowry back, whatever her dad had paid to the husband when he gave her away in marriage, say like an oxen or a donkey or a couple oxen or donkeys or whatever it was. So, okay, now she receives an oxen or a donkey back. Well, not too many things have to go wrong before a widow has to sell her dowry, her oxen, her donkey, and many widows fell through the cracks. Poverty, There was no such thing as a daughter staying true to herself, because it didn't matter what vows or promises she had made to herself or to God or to her friends about who she was going to be or how she was going to live, when she lived in a world where a man could overrule any vow made by a woman. So she had no say in her own faith within her marriage. Whoever her father chose for her to marry, she was expected in her world to give allegiance and devotion to her new husband's gods. Now, say her father married her off to a rich, grouchy man, and say somehow she didn't please her husband, burned the toast, was unable to have children, whatever it was, her husband could divorce her, kick her to the curb for any reason, and in many cases, women like that were left without a safety net and nowhere to turn except prostitution or begging. The inheritance system of Elia, Daniela, and Reba's day made it nearly impossible for women to rise above all of this, to have any kind of personhood. You see, it didn't matter how wealthy your father was. If you were a daughter, you didn't inherit your father's wealth. You didn't receive anything as a permanent possession. No property, no wealth, no voice, no way to rise above it all. And that's just the way it was. Elia, Daniela, and Reba came from a large family. They had 7 brothers who enjoyed all the benefits of their father's wealth. Their brothers all had their own homes, their own property given to them by their wealthy father. Life for them was good. Sometimes the brothers would throw big birthday bashes in their fancy homes. And if Elia, Daniela, and Reba were lucky, the brothers would invite them to share in the festivities. Now, on this particular day, it was the oldest brother's birthday, the firstborn, the big cheese. But it wasn't like attending your oldest brother's birthday, because your oldest brother doesn't have the power to marry you off to the grouchiest rich man you ever saw. So singing happy birthday feels a little different when that's who you're singing to. But on this particular day, it didn't matter who was a son or a daughter. While the birthday bash was in full swing, a strange storm came out of nowhere. The winds began to howl, a tornado, a wind of some kind, and in literally moments, before anyone could do anything, the house was devastated, demolished. Elia, Daniela, Reba, and their 7 brothers were crushed under the weight of the stones. 10 lives cut short. Just like that, Job's children were dead. And that's the prologue of Job, from the perspective of Job's daughters in its ancient Near Eastern cultural context. Now, of course, if you're reading Job chapter 1, uh, you'll notice that these daughters have no name, also no property, no personhood. I took the liberty of naming them. Whatever hopes Job had for Elia, Daniela, and Reba, he was robbed of that day. Every parent who's ever lost a child, every person who's ever lost a loved one understands that there is no replacing people. Job went from being on top of the world to finding himself outside of the city limits, at the town dump, the dunghill, the ash heap, the place of the mourners in the ancient Near East. Bible scholar A. Anderson says this, that the ash heap stands as like this emblem of deepest poverty and desertion, mourning. Thousands of Job's livestock were dead. His servants were slaughtered. His children's bodies crushed, mangled, lifeless, and he was deserted. And every word of the book of Job comes from that ash heap, from the city dump, out of grief, trauma, pain, with Job's body covered in terrible sores, running with pus, clogged with dirt, infested with worms. Eliah, Daniela, Reba, and Job's 7 sons were gone forever. And for 30 some chapters, Job sits in that city dump, the ash heap, insisting that God appear, that they have a court case, that they brawl it out, that God has to answer for his injustice. And as the book comes to a close, God appears to Job out of a whirlwind at the ash heap on the margins of society. And God and Job go rounds with one another. And God asks Job if he knows anything about the complexity of the universe and the nature of creation. If you've been tracking with us throughout the previous 5 weeks, you're up to speed on that. God has asked, does Job understand behemoth, chaos, the infinite number of variables that affect every single thing that happens? Can Job stop Leviathan, the king over all that are proud, the cosmic forces of evil? Does Job know anything? Well, sitting in the ash heap, with worms crawling out of his body, Job finally retracts his case against God. Job chapter 42, verse 2. He accepts that his knowledge of the universe is partial and limited. His idea of God has been distorted, but still, Job claims to know something about God. He says, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. And sitting there in those ashes, Job repents of all the things he accused God of. You give and you take away, you wound and you bind up, you injure and you heal, you laugh at suffering and injustice, you rush at me like a warrior, all the things. All those pictures of God came out of what Job had heard about God. But now, Job says, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. And therefore I'm taking back everything I've said. I repent in dust and ashes. See that? He's still at the ash heap. Job has come to understand that even though chaos, the cosmic forces of evil, even though they bring a world full of suffering, it doesn't mean that God is giving up on his purpose. No purpose can be thwarted. His purpose of his love expanding throughout the universe. God is battling evil, and Job still sits on the ashes, infested with worms. Eliah, Reba, and Daniela, his 7 sons, they're all still dead. But God has one more invitation for Job, and it has to do with his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Now, friends, we're using that word loosely. The book started by calling them friends, but throughout the book, Job has also called them undependable, no help. You're acting like you're the only ones that matter, full of contempt for his misfortunes, smearing him with lies, worthless physicians, miserable comforters, long-winded mockers, hostile, tormentors, crushing him with words, shameless attackers. Like, with friends like that, who needs enemies? While Job is still sitting in his suffering, God invites Job to pray for his enemies. And of course, God accepts that prayer. Job is reconciled with God, and how healing is it to pray for his friends who have wounded him? Now, for many readers of the book of Job, after that there's nothing left but the fairy tale ending. We're told that God restored Job's fortune, gave him twice as much as he had before, like thousands of livestock, and now God gives Job twice as many animals. Job had earlier complained. He said, My relatives have gone away. My closest friends have forgotten me. My guests and my servants count me as a foreigner. They look on me as a stranger. My breath is offensive to my wife. I'm loathsome to my family. All my intimate friends detest me. Those I love have turned against me. So it's this picture of Job when he's out there at the garbage dump on the ash heap. It's not like he has people coming out to him from town trying to take care of him. Uh, they have abandoned him. But now at the end of the book of Job chapter 42, Job's brothers and sisters and everyone who knew him earlier shows up. It's the restoration of fortunes. And they eat with Job and they give him substantial gifts. Those are big gifts. And everyone is full of these nonsensical cliches. They say things like, "Oh, I'm so sorry for all of the trouble, the evil that the Lord brought on you." Well, they obviously don't understand God in the same way Job does and where evil comes from. And how could they? They sound just like Job's friends. And then we are told that God gave Job 3 more daughters. Not Eliah, not Daniela, not Reba, of course, but 3 more daughters and 7 more sons. And we're told that the 3 new daughters are prettier than any of the other girls in the land. It's like icing on the cake. Because, of course, God makes everything all better, no matter what the suffering, with pretty girls. And that's where the story ends. Job lives happily ever after until he dies in peace surrounded by his family. The end. And if that is frustrating to you or unsatisfying to you, you are not alone. The message of Job is articulated by so many people as something like this. It's like, well, you really can't understand suffering or why bad things happen to good people. The universe is really complex and God's ways are a mystery, and there's really nothing you can do about it. And the pretty girls thing is just like this extra, what? The happily ever after thing is frustrating because it doesn't happen for very many people. There are a whole lot of sufferers in this world who would say, the book of Job didn't happen for me. Like, God didn't restore my fortunes. God didn't give me back twice as much of anything. So they say, why would God even think that giving me new loved ones, like new daughters, could somehow replace my lost loved ones? Oh, yay! Thanks for daughters that are prettier. Um, that that's that's not how that works. But the question is that really all there is in the book of Job? Well, let's look back. Because what many people miss about the book of Job is massively important. You see, it's not like Job was indifferent to the suffering of others before his life fell apart. But Job had only seen suffering from the outside, looking in. Job was the greatest man among all the people of the East. He lived on a wealthy farm. He didn't live in the garbage dump, out on the margins of society where most of the suffering was occurring. We're told that Job, there's these lists of all these ways that Job cared for people who were suffering, but he was on the outside. Job's experience of suffering, the ash heap, it opened his eyes to injustice in his world. Suffering looks different from the inside. Specifically, it opened his eyes to the way that the inheritance system, the boundary stones is what they called them, of his day left orphans and widows trying to scrap together a life from the garbage dump, living outside the city, eating whatever they could find, wearing whatever they could find. So take a look back at Job chapter 24. In Job chapter 24, Job is arguing with his friends. His friends are saying, the righteous are blessed and the wicked suffer. And Job says, not true. Like he's seeing the world differently at that point. And here's what he says, Job chapter 24. He says, there are those who move boundary stones. Those are the inheritance property markers. They pasture flocks they've stolen. They drive away the orphan's donkey. They take the widow's ox in pledge. Remember her dowry, like the only thing she gets back after her husband dies? There are people who take the only thing she's got. They thrust the needy from the path. They force all the poor of the land into hiding. Like wild donkeys in the desert, the poor go about their labor of foraging food. The wasteland provides food for their children. They gather fodder in the fields and glean in the vineyards of the wicked. Lacking clothes, they spend the night naked. They have nothing to cover themselves in the cold. They're drenched by mountain rains and hug the rocks for lack of shelter. The fatherless child is snatched from the breast. The infant of the poor is seized for a debt. Remember what we were saying about children being sold as slaves? Lacking clothes, they go about naked. They carry the sheaves, but they still go hungry. They crush olives among the terraces. They tread the wine presses, yet suffer thirst. The groans of the dying rise from the city. The souls of the wounded cry out for help. At the end of the book, not only has Job seen God, but Job has now seen suffering. And Job is ready to join God in changing the world. I'm going to say that again. Not only has Job seen God, Job has seen suffering, and Job is ready to join God in changing the world. What? So you may say, what are you getting at, Aaron? Well, take a look back at how the book of Job ends. The very last lines. After Job's fortunes are restored by God, there's only one thing that we are told that Job did with the rest of his life, 140 years of living. And we are told one thing. Like, what difference did this suffering experience make on Job? Well, here's what we are told. Job also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. The first daughter he named Jemima, the second Keziah, and the third Karen Hapuk. Nowhere in all the land were there found women as well known, useful, good, excellent, beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father granted them an inheritance along with their brothers. After this, Job lived 140 years. He saw his children and their children to the 4th generation, and so Job died an old man and full of years. That word that earlier we were looking at, pretty, we were saying Job's daughters were prettier. Hebrew word Yafeh can also mean well-known, useful, good, excellent, beautiful. It can be literal or metaphorical. See, Job's first 3 daughters, they grew up in a world that identified them by the man in their life. Job chapter 1. So I've named them Eliah, Daniela, and Reba, but we have no idea what their names were because we are not told. But the garbage dump, the ash heap, opened Job's eyes. And notice what he did. The book doesn't tell us the name of Job's firstborn son or any of the other 7 sons that he had when God restored his fortunes. But it does tell us the name of his firstborn daughter, and each and every daughter who Job granted a full inheritance: Jemima, Keziah, Karen, Hapuk, women who the entire land saw not as an extension of a man, but as persons. Well known, good, excellent, useful, beautiful, property owners, creative, daughters, women. But why the change? Well, it has to do with how Job saw God. You see, clear back at the beginning of the book, Job thought that he needed to constantly perform rituals in case his children had offended God. You look at Job chapter 1, verse 5. He says, my livestock and my harvests have to be used to appease God and earn God's acceptance of my children. So I have to keep God happy with these customary burnt offerings. Like I got to burn a cow, basically, to keep God happy with my kids in case my kids have offended God. And so he thought God operated according to a system of rewards and punishments. And that was all before his ash heap experience. His care for the poor was motivated at that point by fear and shame. It was like even the good things he did, you care for the poor so that God doesn't punish you. You're not worthy of acceptance or belonging or any kind of gift unless you earn it. And so you do all the right things. Job chapter 31. And that's why Job thought that he didn't deserve to suffer. He's like, I didn't earn this. Why am I suffering? Well, then at the end of the book, Job sees it differently. He sees that everything he has is the gift of a God who indiscriminately delights to give. God doesn't need Job's friends to burn any cows to appease God's anger. God teaches Job that lesson. Like, I don't need the burnt offering thing with your friends or your kids. And so Job's picture of God and the world and wealth, it changes. He understands that his new children are not immune to suffering. Like chaos happens, there's a terrible adversary out there, Leviathan. But he also understands that Leviathan can't thwart God's purposes, and God delights in giving and seeing his love expand throughout the universe. And so Job comes to understand his wealth differently because he's motivated differently. And so he joins God in changing the world. See, his first three daughters grew up in a male dominated world that told them they weren't people, that they weren't worthy of acceptance, belonging, or any kind of gift, no property, no inheritance, no voice. And Job didn't change the world they grew up in. Their brothers had homes, but the first three daughters, Eliah, Daniela, and Reba, they didn't. Check out Job chapter 1, verse 4. But after Job lived at the garbage dump, he saw firsthand the injustice of the inheritance system, afflicting the orphan and the widow, people just trying to scrap together a life from the ash heap, the garbage dump, eating, wearing whatever they could find. And it's after that that Job delights to call his daughters by name and give them a full inheritance. And all the people in the land recognize his daughters as people, good people, useful people, excellent people, beautiful people. And what Job does there in the very last sentences of the book is countercultural. What impact does it have on a culture when the greatest man among all the peoples of the East pushes against an inheritance system that advantages some while leaving others crying out, suffering in the ash heap, the garbage dump? The book doesn't end by saying, well, Job went back to the garbage dump every now and then, and he brought some clean t-shirts and some sack lunches for the orphans and the widows. Why doesn't it say that? Well, it's already told us that Job has always done that kind of thing. Like, of course, he's still doing that kind of thing. But Job does something more than put a band-aid on the suffering. He models a different system of inheritance, a completely different way of living and treating women. Like, what if all of Job's friends and relatives came to see God and their daughters in the same way that Job did? And so Job puts his money where his mouth is, thousands of dollars and acres and livestock that he gives to his daughters, Jemima, Keziah, Karen Hapuk, well-known, good, useful, beautiful. Now, does that feel a little better than a fairy tale ending? Job joins God in changing the world. May your kingdom come. May your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Job is poetry, so asking, did this happen? Did this really happen? It tends to be a distraction. But still, I wish I could go back and ask the friends and relatives of Job, everyone that was at that barbecue and giving Job gifts and saying ridiculous cliches, I'd like to go back and ask them, all right, how'd this impact you? Did you give your daughters an inheritance too after Job did? Do you make sure to tell people your daughter's name now? How did this change you? What if God isn't the author of your suffering? But what if your suffering is somehow opening your eyes to injustice and to people just trying to survive on the margins of society, on the ash heap? And how might God be sacrificially inviting you to join him in changing the world? And how might you come to understand your wealth and your resources differently and delight to give out of response to God's good gifts to you?